Welcome to an audio Odyssey. The book of the same title was originally published a decade ago, and in the time since, much additional documentary evidence and information regarding Kiss in 1981 has been uncovered. Since a second edition of that book seems unlikely, I thought it would be an interesting and fun challenge to create an Elder supercut, a multi-part audio documentary of sorts exploring varying facets of the Elders' genesis and era. The goal is to keep the assorted chapters concise and focused and purposeful in both standalone and serialized contexts. In this episode, Kiss enter the studio for their first sessions with new drummer Eric Carr. As the year turned from 1980 to 1981, C.K. Lent set the stage perfectly to Tim McFate in a 2012 interview for the original KissFAQ Novelder feature.
When they approached a new album, they had made a number of efforts going into the studio in 1981, recording different tracks at different studios. I know that they tried a number of different types of records. The consensus that they got from the people in Australia at Polygram at that time was that they should come back in 1981 and do another really hard rock album, because that was the essence of what Kiss was, and they felt that that was something that would serve Kiss well. You know, the last advice offer that you hear from people who are in a position to have their advice listened to is often the advice that you go with. So that was their inclination, to go back into the studio and record a typical hard rock, heavy metal Kiss album.
If only things were so simple. Immediately prior to the sessions with Kiss, Eric had drummed on 3 demos for his then-girlfriend, Debbie Pantera Saint. Of those songs, 2, Danger Zone and Love Is Hard, had been written by a mutual friend, Jack Starr, though he was unaware Debbie was recording his songs at the time. Jack formed Virgin Steel during 1981 and included Danger Zone on the group's debut album the following year and Love Is Hard on a solo album in 2002. Virgin Steel is notable as well for including singer David DeFice, brother of Damon, who had been in Eric's pre-Kiss group creation prior to perishing in the 1974 Gulliver's Club fire. Additionally, Jack Starr also auditioned to replace Ace Frehley in 1982. The inclusion of these Pantera demos in the Elder story is a tangential stretch at best, though it's illustrative of how Eric spent some of his downtime following the Australian tour. More so, they're interesting due to their close proximity with the Kiss session. Of greater question is whether Eric violated his Kiss contract by playing on the demo, which was recorded with the purpose of shopping for a record deal. The songs certainly showed off Debbie's powerhouse vocals. She'd been a part of the music scene, having been a part of a later lineup of Mother Nature Father Time prior to branching out with her own group, Hooker, which was active on the Long Island club scene. That group included later White Lion, Ace Frehley Band, and Megadeth bassist James Lomenzo, who was friends with both Debbie and Eric. Regardless, Eric's Kiss contract explicitly specified,
Carr agrees to render such services as Kiss may require, and agrees to render his services exclusively for Kiss, in accordance with the instructions and directions of Kiss.
Eric may have taken Section 6B seriously, particularly the sentence that stated,
In the event that Carr breaches this agreement in any other material way except as provided in Section 6A, Kiss may terminate this agreement.
Naturally, with the details of this session not being widely public until 2021, it seems that there may have been some secrecy around his involvement. However, nothing seems to have come from the demo at the time, so it may simply have been lost to history until rediscovered later. Additionally, with Eric's later issues with the restrictions of his contract, imposed by his employers or self-inflicted due to employment concerns, did prevent him from appearing outside of Kiss, notably on Ace Frehley's 1989 Trouble Walking album. Whatever the case, the January 1981 moonlighting doesn't seem to have caused any problems at that juncture. Funnily enough, engineer Rob Freeman recounted an anecdote about Eric from the sessions that suggests that the Pantera session wasn't too secret at the time. He recalled in a 2022 interview,
"I remember the first day meeting Eric at Ace's studio. He was sitting quietly by himself as I went over to introduce myself. We chatted for a bit, and I was struck by how astonished and grateful he was to become a member of a band he had idolized for so long. He said, just last week I was playing in a Long Island bar band, and now this. This is incredible."
Returning to matters of primary concern, during January 1981, Aucoin management had been fielding questions from International Phonogram affiliates regarding the group's plans to deliver their next studio album. At the end of January, Aucoin's VP and Director of International Affairs, Rick Alibert, responded to the inquiry suggesting that the group would start recording the following week. On February the 3rd, George Sewitt issued a memo detailing the recording schedule at Ace's new Ace in the Hole studio in Wilton, Connecticut. For the New York, New Jersey-based members, it was a 90-minute one-way drive to the 4-acre retreat. Clearly, it was deemed easier for 3 band members, engineers, and an assortment of roadies to be inconvenienced to ensure the erstwhile spaceman's participation in the project. As a studio, Ace in the Hole was more than suitable for purpose, at least for higher-end pre-production demo recordings. Freeman was recruited to engineer the session and had already met with the group during rehearsals at SIR Studios in the city. He'd recorded Ace at the Plaza Sound Studios in 1978 for his solo album, and had also, as described to McFate in 2015, designed and installed a 4-track home studio and state-of-the-art home theater system in Paul Stanley's uptown New York City condo. He may have been seen as something of a bridge, particularly with his connection to Eddie Kramer on that 1978 project, and had been recruited for his previous work with Ace. It was a contrast to Ace's friends such as Chris Cassone, who had engineered his demo sessions for the Dynasty and Unmasked albums at Northlake Studios in White Plains. Ace's new home studio had been designed by sound architect John Stork in mid-1979, following his purchase of his property in 1978, and no expense had been spared to equip it. All the band members were living in their Super Kiss reality at the time. Stork had designed one of Kiss's favorite studios, the legendary Electric Lady Studios, so it was no surprise that he came recommended by Eddie Kramer, if any such recommendation were needed. Again, from McFate's interview, Ace initially only wanted a modest studio constructed in the basement of his new house. The problem was, the basement of the 14-room residential house was completely unsuitable for purpose. As an alternative, John recommended that they use some of the land to build a dedicated recording building. There was 4 acres to work with. It would be separate from the home and could be properly soundproof so as not to disturb Ace's family and neighborhood when it was in use. It would also be John who suggested connecting the studio to the house via a tunnel. Ace loved the flippant idea. Stork recalled to McFate,
"I worked with Eddie to get the basic specs that he needed. I mean, nobody knew more about recording him than Eddie because he had been working with Ace. So it was easy to get all the equipment specs and the needs that he had. And basically, that is exactly what we did. The land kind of sloped, it's hard to explain. The side of his property, the land sloped down. It was easy to basically put the studio into the ground. So it was under the ground, but then one part of it basically daylighted out. And that was the only part you saw. It was a big, giant concrete curved box. Actually, it was pretty. It was one of my favorite studios and favorite designs. It was pushed into the ground, 6 feet lower. The bottom was 6 feet lower and the base was level. We made a hole in his basement and you went through a small tunnel that actually had a skylight in it, believe it or not. You went down and then you entered the studio, which had a modest-sized control room, about a 5-man live room with a small ISO booth. And one edge of the studio was a floor-to-ceiling glass block wall. That wall you'd see from the ground, from the land as you approached the studio. When you went into his property, you took one turn to go to the house and another turn to go to the studio. That's what we ended up doing. The studio was solid concrete. It was basically a giant basement, and the roof was concrete.
Architectural plans suggest that the studio was roughly 50 foot square, divided into a large octagonal room with a glass separation window looking out to the main recording room. A triangular isolation booth was offset, and any 90-degree wall angles were offset with wood resonator panels. Through a sound lock was a storage locker, bathroom, and stairs leading to the tunnel to the house. Even the bathroom was wired for sound, becoming multi-purpose as a live reverb chamber. Most of the recording gear came from Audio Techniques. That key gear included an MCI 600 series automated console, an MCI JH16 24-track 2-inch tape machine, and two MCI 100A 2-track tape machines for mixdowns. It was well equipped for purpose technically. Eric was ready for the new challenge and was excited to get into the studio with his new band, and he didn't arrive empty-handed. He'd come up with a couple of song ideas, even though his contract specified that he wasn't obligated to contribute creatively. One was inspired by his experiences during the touring in Australia. Titled Prisoners of Rock and Roll, it was only at the stage where Eric had roughed out a chord structure. It may have been too wide-eyed and innocent for his road-weary and jaded bandmates. Another, titled Standoff, was only a lyrical song idea that Eric had roughed out. It's not clear whether either of these songs were developed during the sessions or at the rehearsals at SIR. There certainly doesn't appear to have been any shortage of ideas, at least started at Ace in the Hole. Rob recalled that they had worked on a number of tracks during the first few days before settling on 3 or 4 stronger efforts to focus on. He specified in 2022,
There may have been as many as 4 or 5 other tracks recorded in addition to those 3, but they were abandoned, or so I thought at the time, and never elevated to the same state of semi-completion as the main 3.
For many years, the best known of these semi-legendary tracks was Deadly Weapon, later divided and recycled by Gene Simmons as Love's a Deadly Weapon for the Asylum album. Paul Stanley dismissed it in the 2022 box set liner notes as contrived, explaining,
It doesn't ring true for me. It's not authentic. There's a lot of effort to recreate something that is trying to recreate spontaneity, and those two terms are completely at odds with each other. Like a lot of songs at that period, we were either comatose or semi-comatose, and as much as we would try, I just think that it wasn't organic. It was too thought out, and in the sense that we were trying too hard to do something that at a different point had been completely natural and was effortless. We were trying to find our way back home, and we didn't really know how to get there.
And that appraisal can pretty much be applied to all the songs worked out at Ace's studio in February 1981. They were simply throwing spaghetti at the sonic wall to see what would stick. The wall was clearly covered with Teflon. Gene recalled Feel Like Heaven and Reputation being cut at the time. He'd cut an initial demo of the former in 1979, and the latter even earlier, so he was digging into his bone bag of unused songs at this stage. Feel Like Heaven featured a Dynasty-like soft disco inflection, but by that time, Gene had considered it more suitable for his then-girlfriend Diana Ross, with its Motown-inspired vocals. The vocals for the 1981 recording were recorded at Penny Lane Studios, where the Go-Go's were recording their debut, with Rob taking double duties engineering sessions for both groups. Miss Ross wouldn't record the song, so it went to another smoky R&B vocalist, ex-Kiss drummer Peter Criss, for his 1982 Let Me Rock You album. Paul was objectively brutal in his 2022 summation of the song.
That's not our demon. That's Gene in Hollywood. That's someone who had forsaken, for many reasons, an identity, and I think was lost in terms of his roots, and that's not to take a jab at him.
Gene countered that the song gave birth to the bass line in Mr. Blackwell, perhaps having lost touch with the closer inspiration of God of Thunder. The song also featured an uncredited Ghost Session appearance. Rob Freeman recalled in 2022,
We worked on the bulk of the vocals and background vocals at Penny Lane, as well as some overdubs by the late great Jimmy Malin, who was brought in to add some percussion on Feel Like Heaven. The very first thing Jimmy wanted to record was a backwards cymbal effect. Backwards effects were always a real challenge back in the day because the 2-inch multi-track tape needed to be physically flipped over on the machine, and the track numbers had to be counted backwards from 24 to 1. Punching in to record on the wrong track could be disastrous. Just finding where you were in the song while listening to it backwards was no easy task. So I proceeded cautiously with Jimmy, and we got it done. When Gene, the writer of the song, heard the effect, he loved it.
The third of the advanced recordings was the exquisite Nowhere to Run, which has been covered in far greater depth than possible here in a 2023 KissFAQ Song Stories episode. But the essence of that song is that it was the most fully formed of the demos recorded during those sessions in terms of both lyrics and arrangement, even though it didn't receive lead guitar overdubs at the time. Ultimately, it would be the only of the demos to receive official release, turning up on Kiss Killers the following year, and in some ways bringing the band full circle to where they were following the Unmasked album. So in two ways, the song ended up being a cathartic exercise, inspired as a reaction to the end of a brief and torrid relationship, and later as flushing the elder from the system with similar intent. The question of Gene's reputation being cut at this time is probably accurate, though there's no confirmed copy of any recording attributed to those sessions. The song title was at least mentioned in several interviews during the period. It's not clear whether the additional abandoned songs included ideas recorded at later sessions, but Gene suggested in 1982 that roughly 10 songs had been recorded prior to the Elder concept entering the picture. Simple Maths adds 3 semi-finished Ace in the Hole songs, with the 5 known instrumental tracks cut at Phase 1 in May. While the sessions were ongoing, the Ace-related Eugene single from the Crazy Joe and the Variable Speed Band was bubbling under on the Billboard Hot 100, very nearly making that chart. It peaked at number 105 on February the 28th. The full album was also released around this time.
My name is Eugene.
Regardless, by the end of the month, Bob Ezrin had been engaged to produce a project with Kiss. Freeman's interaction with Ezrin was brief and terse. Rob recounted to Tim McFate in 2012.
I had never met Bob Ezrin prior to his appearance at Ace's studio in late February 1981. But the level of his success and the quality of his work preceded him, as did his reputation for being highly demanding in the studio. I recall looking forward to meeting him, but with some degree of trepidation. This feeling justified itself at one point when Mr. Ezrin was walking out the studio door and into the parking lot. I was inside the control room with some 30 feet and lots of acoustic baffling between us. I heard him snap something to me about packing up the 2-inch master tapes and sending them to an address in Canada that he rattled off just as he stepped through the door, and his voice faded into the outdoor ambiance. I bolted after him and quite innocently asked if he would repeat the address so I could write it down. He just muttered something to the effect of, "If you didn't get all that, you shouldn't be working with me," got in his car, and drove off. That was the last time I saw Mr. Ezrin.
Things must have happened fast, for by March the 3rd, Bill Aucoin had paid off Freeman with $8,000 for his services for roughly 200 hours worth of work. In internal documentation, Aucoin confirmed his role as both engineer and co-producer of the session with Kiss for the resultant demos. With the Bob Ezrin reset in place, pre-production was scheduled to restart in March, running through April due to Bob's schedule, and recording was expected to begin in May. Things would change, but that period will be explored in the Phase 1 chapter of the Audio Odyssey. The 3 semi-complete Ace in the Hole Penny Lane demos were released as part of the 2022 Creatures of the Night Super Deluxe Edition box set. While these may seem to dash hardcore fans' hopes of ever receiving a deluxe Elder treatment, their inclusion wasn't a matter of gratuitous padding for the Creatures reissue product. The songs had been reviewed for potential use, along with other abandoned 1981 song ideas when Kiss started working with producer Michael James Jackson in early 1982. That topic will be covered in far more detail in a forthcoming War Machine project. This installment will be followed by an investigation into the quest for a producer, which Bob Ezrin's recruitment ultimately resolved. Special thanks are extended to Tim McFate for his incredible work conceptualizing and executing the Novelda project that evolved into the Odyssey book. The majority of those interviews were his idea and work and remain an invaluable contribution to documenting